I was seated near the end of the conference table, hands folded, feet flat on the floor. The chair was solid. The table edge was cool under my fingertips. The screen at the front of the room still showed the last slide from my deck. That was when Mark leaned back and said it out loud. "We're not putting you forward for project lead." No preamble, no transition, just the sentence, delivered like a decision that had already aged. Around the table, a few people shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The glass wall reflected 12 of us, all senior enough to know what this meant. I stayed still. I didn't look at Mark. I watched the reflection instead. He continued, warming to it. "This project needs someone with the right background, someone clients can recognize immediately." He paused, then added, "No offense, it's just reality." No offense. The phrase landed and hovered. Across from me, Denise glanced down at her notes. 2 seats over, someone checked their phone and then stopped, as if realizing how visible it was. The room went quiet in that way that isn't empty. It was loaded, waiting. I didn't respond. Mark mistook that for permission. "We've talked about this before," he said, tapping his pen once against the table. "Your work is solid, reliable, but leadership is a different lane. This isn't the place to experiment." Experiment. That word drew a faint, involuntary reaction from someone near the window. A small inhale, then nothing. I looked at the agenda packet in front of me. My name was still printed beside the project title, bolded like a fact that hadn't been updated yet. The paper didn't change when things changed. It just waited. "This isn't personal," Mark added. His voice had the practiced calm of someone used to being agreed with. "We just don't think it's appropriate to put you in front of the board." Denise finally spoke, too quickly. "We need to be strategic." Strategic. Another word that sounded neutral until you counted how often it landed on the same people. Mark nodded. "Exactly, strategic." He looked at me then, directly, expectantly. "Well," he said, "you understand." I let the silence stretch. Not out of defiance, out of precision. Silence changes the shape of a room if you give it time. The air conditioning clicked on. Someone's chair creaked. No one else spoke. "I understand the decision has been made," I said finally. My voice was even, measured. "Is there anything else you need from me on this agenda item?" It wasn't a challenge, it was procedural. Mark blinked once, not the response he expected. "No," he said, then, recovering, "no. That's all." I nodded and looked back down at the packet. The meeting moved on without me, though I was still there. Timelines were reassigned. Names were swapped out. My slide disappeared from the screen and was replaced by a placeholder with someone else's initials. Nobody apologized. Nobody explained further. The assumption was that I would absorb it quietly, that I would adjust. That had always been the assumption. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped back. People gathered their things in small, careful motions, like they were stepping around something fragile on the floor. A few avoided eye contact. One person gave me a tight, sympathetic smile and then looked away. Mark clapped his hands once. "All right, let's execute." As if execution had ever been the problem, I stood after most of them had already left. I straightened the papers, aligned the corners, slid them into my folder. My hands didn't shake. There was nothing to steady. As I walked out, I caught my reflection again in the glass wall. Same posture, same expression. Nothing had been taken from me that I was using in that moment. Behind me, the room fell quiet again. Not awkward. Not loud. Just finished. My name is Alina Marrow. I was 38 at the time, living alone in a rented townhouse 15 minutes from the office, close enough that traffic never decided my mood for me. I'd been with the firm just under 9 years. Long enough to be known. Long enough to be useful. I worked in operational strategy. Not the kind that shows up in press releases. The kind that keeps regulatory deadlines from being missed and client penalties from becoming headlines. I was the person teams called when something had quietly gone wrong and needed to be corrected without spectacle. My background had never been a secret. I didn't come up through the same schools as most of them. I didn't arrive with a sponsor already in place. I built credibility the slow way, through delivery, documentation, and consistency. Over time, that creates a certain standing. Not glamorous, durable. After the meeting, I went back to my office and closed the door. I didn't sit right away. I set my bag down, placed the folder on the desk, and aligned it with the edge. The room was clean, neutral, intentional. I liked it that way. There was no urge to confront anyone, no impulse to explain myself. The decision had been spoken publicly. That mattered more than the words themselves. Public decisions create records, whether people intend them to or not. I sent 2 emails before noon. One confirmed revised deliverables. The other acknowledged the change in leadership assignment, copied to the same distribution list that had just watched it happen. No commentary, no tone. What happened in that room wasn't about preference or personality. It was about fairness and authority being misapplied in plain sight. I had learned over the years that when people underestimate you openly, they often do it from inside a system they don't fully understand. I locked my screen, turned off the light, and went to lunch as planned. What happened in that room wasn't new. It was just cleaner than usual. Over time, patterns simplify. You stop needing to interpret them. You just note when they repeat. In my first year at the firm, I was assigned to a compliance remediation project that had stalled twice. The scope was unclear, the deadlines were unrealistic, and 3 people had already cycled through the lead role. I wasn't named lead. I was listed as support. That word appeared often next to my name. I rebuilt the timeline, documented the regulatory exposure, and broke the work into phases that could actually be completed. When the project closed on schedule, Mark presented the outcome to senior leadership. My name appeared once, in small font on the final slide. That became familiar. I was pulled into projects late, usually after something had gone wrong. Data discrepancies, missed filings. Clients asking questions no one wanted to answer. I didn't argue scope. I fixed what was in front of me and left a paper trail behind. Quiet trails, but complete ones. In meetings, I noticed how decisions were framed. Leadership potential was discussed in vague terms. Presence, fit, board-facing. None of it had metrics attached. Delivery did. So did risk mitigation. Those were easier to measure, and they were where I stayed. There were moments I could have pushed back, asked for formal recognition, requested a title adjustment. I chose not to, not because I didn't want advancement, but because timing matters. Pressure applied at the wrong point gets absorbed. Pressure applied at the right point changes structure. Silence, when sustained long enough, becomes positioning. 2 years in, I was assigned responsibility for maintaining a set of internal controls tied to a long-term client portfolio. The role came with access, not visibility. I reviewed quarterly attestations, verified cross-departmental sign-offs, and flagged discrepancies before they escalated. The work required precision and discretion. It also required trust. Trust accumulates quietly. I watched others move ahead of me, people with louder voices, cleaner narratives, the kind of backgrounds that read well in bios. When projects succeeded, leadership rotated credit upward. When something failed, accountability moved laterally or down. Once, after a particularly long week, Denise stopped by my office. "You're really good at this," she said, gesturing vaguely at my screen. "You keep everything from blowing up." I thanked her. She didn't suggest a role change. Compliments don't alter structure. Decisions do. The pattern clarified further during annual reviews. My evaluations were consistently strong. Language like critical contributor and reliable under pressure appeared year after year. Promotion discussions were deferred, not denied, deferred, always with a reason that couldn't be documented. I kept copies of everything, not out of suspicion, out of habit, version histories, approval chains, time-stamped emails. When work is invisible, records are the only way it exists. At some point, I realized something else. The system they were using to limit me was the same system that depended on me to function. That imbalance wasn't emotional. It was operational. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't escalate. I didn't withdraw. I continued to do the work I was assigned, at the level it required. Over time, that kind of consistency attracts responsibilities others avoid. By the time the project from the meeting was announced, my role was already defined elsewhere. Not publicly, not formally, but clearly. Patterns don't announce themselves when they're forming. They only become obvious when someone assumes they're permanent. That assumption, I had learned, was rarely safe. The structure that mattered wasn't visible from the conference room. It never was. Years earlier, after a minor regulatory incident that had cost the firm 6 figures in penalties, leadership approved a quiet reorganization of oversight responsibilities. Nothing dramatic, no announcement, just a redistribution of accountability designed to prevent the same failure from happening twice. I was assigned to that framework gradually, first as a reviewer, then as a secondary signatory, eventually as the designated continuity holder for a specific class of projects tied to long-term revenue exposure. The role wasn't prestigious. It didn't come with a new title. It came with obligations. The system was built to survive turnover. People left. Leaders changed. The controls stayed. Every quarter, I reviewed documentation that most people skimmed: risk assessments, escalation thresholds, conditional authority clauses buried in appendices no one liked to read. The language was dry by design. Precision discourages improvisation. I didn't design the structure. I didn't ask for it. I was assigned because I was consistent and because I didn't treat discretion as leverage. Over time, that distinction mattered. There were checks in place: independent audits, legal review, external verification. Authority within the system wasn't symbolic. It was conditional, earned through compliance and maintained through performance. Miss a requirement and access narrowed. Meet it and responsibility expanded. I met it. Not once. Repeatedly. The work required patience. Sometimes weeks passed without any action beyond monitoring. Sometimes there were long delays while other departments responded to queries they didn't consider urgent. I followed up without escalation. I documented responses. I waited. Waiting, when it's intentional, is not passive. There were moments when leadership brushed against the edges of the system without realizing it. A proposal that assumed authority they didn't technically hold. A deadline moved without the necessary sign-off. Each time, I corrected the record quietly, citing the relevant clause, attaching the appropriate documentation. No one pushed back. They rarely do when the language is clear. By the time the new project was announced, the one I'd been publicly excluded from, the framework had already classified it. High exposure, multi-year implications, oversight required, continuity mandatory. Those classifications weren't flexible. They existed to prevent precisely the kind of decision-making that favors optics over structure. I didn't attach myself to the project. I didn't volunteer. My name didn't appear on the initial materials. That wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. The system doesn't respond to interest. It responds to triggers. The trigger came automatically. An internal notice was generated. Standard language. No urgency markers. Just confirmation that the project fell under an existing oversight requirement and would proceed accordingly. It was rooted through legal, compliance, and executive operations. I was included because the system included me. No one questioned it. That was the point. I reviewed the notice, checked the references, and archived it. Then I closed the file and moved on to the next item on my list. There was no satisfaction in it. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. People assume power announces itself. It doesn't. It accumulates quietly in the spaces where responsibility lives longer than attention. When Mark told me I would never lead a project like that, he wasn't wrong in the way he thought he was right. Leadership, as he understood it, had already passed me by. Authority hadn't. And authority doesn't require permission to exist. The review was scheduled for Thursday at 10. Executive conference room. Legal present. Compliance dialed in. 2 board liaisons seated along the far wall, observing rather than participating. I arrived early and took a seat near the middle of the table. Same posture as before. Folder placed squarely in front of me. I didn't open it. There was no need. Mark came in last, already talking. He looked relaxed, confident. The kind of confidence that assumes alignment because it's used to it. "Let's keep this efficient," he said, dropping into his chair. "We've got momentum." No one responded immediately. Legal was arranging their documents. Compliance adjusted the speaker volume. A glass of water was set down near the head of the table, aligned carefully with a coaster. Silence settled. Intentional this time. The general counsel cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she said, "there's a procedural item we need to address." Mark waved a hand. "If it's about resourcing, we've handled it." "It's not," she replied. Her tone didn't change. "It concerns oversight authority." That got his attention. She slid a document across the table, not toward him but to the center, neutral ground. The paper was thick, formal. "This project has been classified as high exposure under the existing governance framework," she continued. "As such, it falls under continuity review." Mark frowned. "That's standard. We've complied." Compliance spoke up through the speaker. "Compliance is not the issue, authority is." A pause, short, measured. Mark leaned forward. "Whose authority?" The general counsel glanced down at the document, then looked up. "The designated continuity holder." Denise shifted in her seat. "That's not." She stopped herself. The counsel turned a page. The sound was crisp in the quiet room. "The continuity holder for this class of projects," she said, "is Alina Marrow." No one looked at me right away. The words took a moment to land. "That can't be right," Mark said. His voice sharpened. "She's not leading this project." "I'm not," I said calmly, one sentence, then silence. The counsel nodded. "Leadership and authority are not the same thing." Mark laughed once. It was brief, uncertain. "This is a misunderstanding." Compliance spoke again. "It's not." Another document was placed on the table, then another. The stack grew. I focused on the edge of my folder, still closed. The table's surface reflected the overhead lights in clean lines. "The designation was made 3 years ago," the counsel continued. "Reviewed annually, all requirements met, no revocation on record." Mark looked around the room. "Why wasn't I informed?" "You were," Compliance said, "via quarterly attestations." "I don't recall." "Your signature appears here," the counsel said, tapping the page. Not hard, just enough to mark it. Denise spoke, her voice tight. "This is about oversight, not control. We can still proceed." "Proceed, yes," the counsel agreed. "Unilaterally, no." Mark turned to me. His expression shifted. Calculation replacing certainty. "Alina," he said, lowering his voice, "you could have mentioned this." I didn't respond. The silence stretched. It wasn't confrontational. It was procedural. The kind that waits for authority to speak. The board liaison near the window finally did. "What does the framework require?" The counsel answered. "That all material decisions, representations, and leadership appointments receive concurrence from the continuity holder. And if concurrence isn't granted, then the project pauses," Compliance said. "Automatically," Mark's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. She's been sidelined. That alone." "That's not relevant," the counsel said. "The designation is independent of role assignment." Denise shook her head. "We can appeal this." "You can submit a review request," Compliance replied. "It will be evaluated in 90 days. 90 days, Mark repeated. "Yes." The room went quiet again, this time heavier. Mark looked at me, really looked. "Are you planning to block this?" I met his gaze briefly, then looked back down at the table. "I'm following the framework," I said. 2 sentences would have been too many. The counsel turned another page. "For the record," she said, "Miss Marrow has already completed her preliminary review." Mark's head snapped back to her. "Already?" "Yes," she said, "as required." Compliance added, "Findings were submitted yesterday." Denise leaned forward. "And?" The counsel didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her glasses, let the pause do its work. "There are deficiencies," she said finally, "in leadership qualification under the framework's criteria." Mark stood halfway out of his chair. "This is absurd." "No," the board liaison said quietly. "It's documented." Mark looked around, searching for support. He didn't find it. "Fix it," he said to me. "You know how this works." I folded my hands. "The framework does." Another silence, longer this time. The counsel closed the folder. "Given the findings, the current leadership assignment cannot proceed." Denise exhaled sharply. "So what happens?" "The framework determines next steps," Compliance said, "including interim authority." "And who is that?" Mark asked, his voice tight. The counsel didn't look at me when she answered. She didn't need to. "The continuity holder." The room stayed quiet after that, not because there was nothing to say, because there was nothing left to argue. Mark sat back down slowly. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving something closer to panic. "This isn't over," he said. "No," the counsel replied evenly. "It's concluded." I remained seated as the meeting adjourned. I didn't gather my things right away. There was no urgency. The system had already moved. When the room finally emptied, I stood, closed my folder, and aligned it with the edge of the table. Nothing had changed in my posture. Everything else had. I wasn't present for what followed. That was intentional. Institutional processes don't need witnesses. They need time. 2 weeks after the review, a formal notice went out to the executive team. Standard language. No commentary. It outlined the pause, the required remediation steps, and the interim authority structure. There was a window for response. It closed without resolution. Mark submitted a review request. Denise co-signed it. The documentation was thorough. The outcome wasn't. 90 days later, the decision stood. By then, the project had already adjusted around the pause. Timelines shifted. Client expectations were reset. Leadership visibility narrowed. Momentum, once interrupted, doesn't always return to the same hands. I learned about most of this indirectly. A forwarded calendar cancellation. A revised organizational chart circulated without explanation. A compliance bulletin noting the conclusion of an internal review. No one called me to discuss it. There was nothing to discuss. Mark's authority contracted first, not removed, reduced. Oversight layers appeared where there hadn't been any before. Decisions that once moved with a nod now required concurrence. That kind of friction accumulates. By the end of the quarter, he was no longer listed as executive sponsor on any high-exposure initiatives. His name still appeared on internal communications, but less frequently and lower down. Visibility changes before titles do. Denise lasted longer. She always did. But her access narrowed as well. Invitations stopped arriving. Meetings were reassigned. The quiet work, the kind that leads to influence, moved elsewhere. There were appeals, not dramatic ones, procedural. Each followed the same path. Each failed for the same reason. The framework didn't bend. It wasn't designed to. I wasn't mentioned in those efforts. Not directly. My role had become administrative, fixed, unremarkable. That was preferable. 6 months later, a short notice appeared on the internal portal. Leadership realignment. Effective immediately. Mark's role had been redefined. Denise's responsibilities redistributed. No reasons given. None required. Clients adapted quickly. They always do. Systems outlast personalities. By the end of the year, Mark had left the firm. The announcement was brief, thankful, neutral. Denise followed shortly after under different circumstances. There were no farewells that reached my inbox. I continued my work. Reviews, sign-offs. Continuity, the framework didn't change. It rarely does once it proves itself. I wasn't contacted for comment. I wasn't asked to explain anything. That was the point. Consequences don't need narration. They just need space to unfold. And they did. A year later, the office felt different, quieter, not in volume but in friction. Decisions moved with fewer detours. Approvals arrived on time. The systems did what they were designed to do when they weren't being overridden for convenience. I kept the same schedule, same route to work, same desk. There was no promotion announcement tied to what happened, no public acknowledgement. Authority doesn't always come with ceremony, and it doesn't require validation once it's established. The project eventually moved forward under a revised structure. New leadership, clear qualifications. The framework remained intact. I signed off where required and stepped back where appropriate. That balance mattered. Power held too tightly draws attention. Power applied correctly disappears into function. Occasionally, someone new would ask how I came to be involved at that level. I answered plainly. I had been assigned. I met the requirements. The rest was process. There were moments, brief ones, when I noticed the absence of certain voices. The meetings that no longer carried an edge. The conversations that no longer required translation. I didn't linger on it. Order, once restored, doesn't benefit from inspection. Fairness, I've learned, isn't about equal outcomes. It's about systems doing what they promise when tested. I made one change that year. I requested that a portion of our internal training budget be redirected toward mentorship for employees without traditional pipelines into leadership roles. It was approved without discussion, framed as risk mitigation, which it was. Nothing about my demeanor changed. I didn't need it to. The work spoke in ways I didn't have to. I still see Mark's name occasionally attached to commentary or advisory work elsewhere. Denise, too. The world is large, and consequences don't follow people forever. They just close certain doors. As for me, my role remained what it had always been, defined, trusted, and unremarkable to anyone who didn't understand how the system worked. The matter was finished, and it stayed that way.